Oh, it works. Wonderful. Well, hello everybody. Thank you for joining me today and for having me here. My name is Tobie Langel. I'm actually born and raised in Geneva, and so French is my mother tongue. And speaking to you all in English is kind of weird here, but we'll have to do with it. I've been working as an independent consultant for a number of years now. I was employed for a bit in the middle of that at Facebook, where I worked on open source and web standards. And now I really focus on open source strategy. So I help companies figure out an open source strategy that makes sense to them. So this is not going to be a tech talk. So you know, it's going to talk a lot about money, because the problem of open source sustainability is really connected to the problem of money. So if that scares you, maybe now is the time to leave. If not, I hope you'll stay around. It is a talk that's really developer focused, even if it's not a tech talk. So I hope it's going to be a decent mix for you all. So we're in small groups. So if there's something that really you have a huge question in the middle of the talk, I'm actually happy to take it in the middle of the talk. If not, just wait and we'll do a Q&A at the end. If I speak too quickly, I don't know if the audience is mainly English speaking or not, but if I do speak too quickly, feel free to gently ask me to slow down. Who here is familiar with that logo? Oh, good. So can you enlighten us?
It's Heartbleed.
Yeah, it's the Heartbleed bug, right? So for those that are not familiar, it's with the logo and not familiar with the bug itself, it's a pretty serious bug that happened on the OpenSSL library now a couple of years ago. And that had a really large impact on the ecosystem at large, the internet ecosystem, mainly because that OpenSSL library is shipped in a huge number of servers and is the default way of encrypting communication on the web, right? So the consequences of that bug, and so the OpenSSL, is an open source library, right? As the name sort of suggests. The consequences of that bug were pretty serious. I mean, for example, 4.5 million patient records who suddenly were potentially accessible is, in a privacy concerned society as we are today, and even regardless, a pretty serious problem. And the estimated cost for the industry, was over half $500 million. So that's also, a sign of how big of an impact it had. I find it really interesting because to me, it's a pivotal moment in our perception as an industry of open source. And that for mainly three reasons, right? With Heartbleed, people suddenly, in the industry, start to understand that open source is ubiquitous. It's actually everywhere, it's in everyone's stack, right? There's a number of studies on that topic. If you're familiar with the company Black Duck, that does, basically checks repositories when there are mergers or acquisitions of companies to check for what kind of software is in the company that a company is purchasing or merging with. They found that 97 code bases that they test, 97% of the code bases that they test every year contains open source. And in those repositories, it's more than half of the code that is open source. So and they test, I think, between 10 and 1,200 companies a year, right? So it's a pretty large data set, and it really speaks to how ubiquitous open source is. The second thing that people were not necessarily aware of is that open source is not only in the woohoo, nice and shiny stuff on the front end, right? It actually is a critical part of the stack. I mean, you can't really get more critical than the library that is encrypting all of the communications. And the last part, which was really the shocking part for everyone, and that is the reason behind the Heartbleed bug, is how underfunded the open source is, right? OpenSSL library was one guy working on the library. full-time, right? And a budget of roughly $2,000 on top of his own time. So when you think about like how important and how critical that library is to the whole ecosystem, that is pretty scary. So that triggered a period of time where everyone started wondering about the cost of open source, and we started hearing about maintainer burnout, the cost of maintaining open source software, and that's also a moment when we started to see innovation in that space to try to find a solution to that sustainability problem. And the first thing people started to do is use existing tools to see how they could use those tools to monetize the open source work that they were doing so they could make a better living and thus support the open source software they were working on in a better way. So that's Patreon, right? And on the right-hand side here is Evan Yu, which is the lead developer and the main maintainer of Vue.js. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's a client-side library that sort of competes a bit in the same space as React does, for example. So what he did is he used Patreon, which was an existing platform originally designed for artists and writers to create a meaningful revenue stream to support him working full-time on that project. And he actually did a really good job of that because he was able to now he's making over $17,000 per month through Patreon. So that's a decent salary for an engineer. He works in San Francisco. So he would probably make more if he was working at Google or with some of the large companies. But it's a really decent way to make a living, right? The problem, however, is that's a hard thing to reproduce, right? You won't see a lot of, there aren't many other open source projects that were able to create such a large revenue stream from Patreon. Another option that's an interesting one that has been created recently is GetCoin. So GetCoin is obviously blockchain based because blockchain, right? It's usually a good strategy to do anything these days. And what it is, it's basically a GitHub issue market. So you have a project, an open source project, you want some help on a bunch of issues, you attach a bounty to whoever's going to fix that issue. And basically GetCoin acts as like a third trusted party in the transaction. So you give GetCoin that money when the pull request is accepted from a developer. GetCoin gives the money to that developer and makes a cut for the transaction. So I'm going to again talk about money here. They've been giving back roughly $500,000 over the course of 2018 to the community, which is a nice amount. And what's really interesting about GetCoin is the team behind it. They're based in I think between Utah and Colorado, and they're trying to do a solution that is like a whole ecosystem of solutions, right? So they have GetCoin, that's one of them. And the other thing that they have is CodeFund, which is an ad that is specific to developers and open source. At first, they actually did it on the README of GitHub projects. But that obviously got GitHub a bit annoyed, right? So they no longer do that. Now you can actually, as a maintainer of an open source project, have these ads on your main web page. And they're so-called ethical ads. I love that we actually have that term now. In the sense that they don't track you. They're based on the context, right? Which is really easy to establish. It's an open source project, say in Java. As a hiring manager, you're looking for Java engineers. So you just put some ads on a well-known, well-used Java project. And that gets you the interest of a lot of passive candidates. Candidates are not actively looking for a job, but maybe seeing the nice an interesting offer or something that could be cool, might be happy to join this other company. So again, cash perspective, like they're selling about $10,000 of ads per month, and they're giving back $6,000 to the community of maintainers. So, you know, sort of a nice amount if this is like your business and it's like a small side project, but obviously not a real sustainable solution to open source. So another route that's been considered in the past for some open source projects, and that has seen a lot of interest over the course of this year, is of course VC funding. I'm sure you've seen Microsoft acquiring GitHub, IBM acquiring Red Hat, the MongoDB APO, and a whole bunch of other sort of like large open source projects creating companies around a project that was quite valuable. Usually, people who work in open source are not really inclined to go that route, and frankly, I understand them, but this has created appetite for VCs in that space, and there's now an open source VC fund called OSS Capital, which is focused strictly on funding open source companies. So companies whose core business is basically monetizing an open source project. Anyone here has heard of Open Collective? So that's, again, an interesting story. It's a project that was initially designed to help communities organize and fund, and then have like really good transparency around how the money was used, right? And so they sort of launched about at the same time as the Heartbleed bug came up, and they really have been surfing the wave of open source since then. And so they've been used quite a bit, actually, by a number of big projects. I don't know if you're familiar with Webpack, for example. Webpack is making all of its money from Open Collective. And so basically what they do is they provide you with a legal entity that can collect charity donations, that does all of the accounting and the transactions, and then that provides a way to transparently show where that money is going. So it's a success story for Webpack, because Webpack is now making $4,100 per year on this, which means that they have at least one developer full-time, plus like a couple of other people working part-time on it. But the problem, of course, of Open Collective is a typical long-tail problem that you see with companies such as Amazon, which is that the very few that are making a lot, right? Like a very few number of companies are getting all of the money. So for example, Webpack by itself gets 25% of the money that goes to Open Collective, right? And then the long tail get basically peanuts or like pocket change, and that doesn't really help them. And the only ones, and usually in sort of those like long tail strategies that are making money are the blockbusters, so the top ones, and the platform that is just getting a bit of everything, right? So this is a typical example of what you see, for example, with Amazon. So what they did recently is they launched this project called Back Your Stack, which is pretty cool. What it does is, if you have a GitHub organization, you can just plug the name of the GitHub organization in the Back Your Stack website, and it's going to give you a list of all of the open source software that your organization relies on. So it looks at all of the packages and looks at the dependencies of all of your software, and then it can give you a list of basically all of the software that you use, and either let you choose which ones you want to donate to, or basically self-manages the money that you give them, right? So you can say, well, okay, here's all of this open source software, I'm ready to give, I don't know, 5,000 francs a month to support open source. An Open Collective, please give the money, spread the money the way you best see fit to the projects that I'm relying on. So another actor in that space is Tightlift. So Tightlift is interesting. Who here is familiar with Red Hat and Red Hat's business model? Does that sort of? So basically, Red Hat invests a lot in Linux, right? They have their own distribution, which is Fedora. And the way they actually make money is by providing service, by productizing the open source software, by providing service and maintenance of the software, patching it for security updates, and all of the kind of stuff that large enterprise buyers really care about. Because when you have like a whole stack of applications on top of an operating system, you want to make sure that this operating system is sustainable, is going to be there in like 3 or 5 years and be patched and be able to have service around it if you need it to make sure that it's deployed properly in your boxes, etc. Right? So that's Red Hat's business model. And so Tightlift is actually an ex-Red Hat employee that founded Tightlift. And his idea is, how can we provide the same kind of service that Red Hat is providing, but for a whole bunch of, well, basically for the long tail I was talking about earlier, right? All of the smaller projects which can't set up all of the structure that they need to be able to provide the kind of services large enterprise buyers want to buy. And so that's what Tightlift does. So basically what you can do is, similar to back your stack, you plug in your organization that's going to tell you, here is all the software you rely on, and then you buy a service, which is actually quite expensive from them, which, in exchange of which they will be making sure that the software is patched for security, and so on, and they do that by paying the maintainers of the open source software to do the work. So I think that they've just got funded to the amount of like $20+ million really recently, and they've committed, I think, to give spend at least $1 million the next year in paying maintainers to work on that software. So this is to keep on the theme of like bees. Okay. So all this is really good. All of these projects are really amazing and fun, and it's great that there is all of that energy in this space. But if you add up the numbers, they're not very big numbers, right? Have any of you seen this graphic, this little video that was around maybe 3 or 4 years ago to explain the American debt? Okay, so it's good. It's even better if you haven't seen it. So that video was made by a company, by a website called democracy.info, and they've actually let me use the whole structure of their diagram to explain the funding issue we have with open source. So if you look, if we stash, so here's a $100 bill, right? If we have 100 of those, we have $10,000, and that is the monthly revenue of CodeFund, the open source ethical ads I showed you a bit earlier. Now, if we pack 100 of those together, and we have this nice pile of cash, this is what $1 million looks like, right? So $1 million, to give you again context, is what Open Collective gives back to the community in a year, right? And it's what Tightlift has committed to pay developers. Okay. So if we compare that to something that's comparable, which is the worldwide developer population, right? We have data around this, and the numbers is roughly that there are 22.3 million developers in the world, okay? About half of those are full-time, right? Sorry. About half of those are full-time. A quarter, roughly, part-time, and then the rest are hobbyists. So if we do some quick back of the envelope math here to try to have an idea of what kind of number we're talking about, again, in money-wise, when we look at how much money the industry is spending on talent, right? So we have 12 million full-time developers, roughly, and I use $65,000 as an average of what a developer costs per year in salary. I have no idea how good that number is. it seems sort of reasonable, and it's back of the envelope math anyway. If you think it's too high, just consider that that counts like their space and their equipment and like social charges and stuff. And if you think it's way too low, it just makes my point better. So, and the reason I chose 65,000, to be very honest with you, is because it gives me a nice round number at the end. So if you look at that, that gives you $780 billion, right? That's the average money, well, sorry, that's the total money spent on wages in the world for developers. If you add part-time, you can add roughly $210 billion to that amount. And very roughly, the whole gives you $1 trillion, right? So $1 trillion is a lot of money, but we really usually have a lot of trouble understanding how much money that is. So let's go back to $1 million sort of pile of cash. Now, if we stack 100 of those on a pallet, like a regular pallet you find like everywhere, that gives you $100 million, right? If you stack 100 of those, obviously. Now, to get to $1 billion, you need 10 of those pallets, right? So far, so good. We're still very far from $1 trillion, right? Yeah, you see where I'm getting at. So this is $10 billion, right? A 10 by 10 square of $100 million pallets. And so to get $1 trillion, what you need is this amount of money, okay? So this huge tower, you can see there's a little truck there, right here, right? And down there, we have this guy here with the $1 million stack, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is to show you the massive difference there is between the solutions in the industry that everyone is looking at to solve the problem of open source sustainability, right? And actually what the whole industry is spending just on developers. Wait, before I get to this. Yeah, so, and when you look at how much Heartbleed costs the industry, right, which is $500 million, which in our stack is, well, 5 pallets, right? You also see just the discrepancy between what money we're spending on open source right now and just the liability, the risk of like one critical open source component having a bug. So this doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, it's a terrible strategy as an industry, right? The other reason that bothers me about the idea of the solutions that we're looking at, the idea of giving money to a small number of developers to work on open source, is the fact that, and this is a quote from DHH, the inventor of Rails, from a really good blog post he wrote called The Perils of Mixing Open Source and Money. He wrote in 2013. And basically what he says in this quote, and what he says in this article, is there is a lot of value and a lot of right in alignment of incentives when you have developers that are producing open source as part of their work. And not when you have sort of professional open source development on one side, and then the rest of the developers just using that technology. And to make that example even more clear, this is, if you look at the Linux kernel, right? So the Linux Foundation has the data on which developer is actually working on the kernel and who they work for. And you realize that 93%, well 92%, sorry, of developers working on the Linux kernel are actually doing that as part of their day job, right? It's part of the work that they do for the company in which they're hired for, and they're not like solely focused on, they're not employed by the foundation, for example, right? They're employed by a company, IBM, Red Hat, Intel, to work on the Linux kernel, And as doing so, they're bringing a whole lot of what that particular company cares about. And so they have a really direct connection between actual needs of the people using the software and the software itself that you risk losing if you're basically only building open source as as a business. And then the last part is just that open source is really great. Like, I owe my whole career in software development to my involvement in open source. I've learned pretty much how to program software by looking at open source code and learning on the job. And I think that it's something that everyone in the industry, every developer in the industry, deserves to be able to do. Like, I really don't like the idea of having a cast of open source developers and then the rest of us just like writing glue code to use their implementations. It's not like a future that I wish on anyone, and I think everyone can really benefit from being part of that community. And to me, the real way that we can have a long-term solution to open source is not by funding bits of it the way we're looking at doing now. It's by making companies understand the value that they can get out of open source themselves. So it's not only, basically it's the idea that once we explain well to companies that they can get something out of it directly, once you have an open source strategy that is aligned with the business objectives of the companies you're working for, it's a lot easier for those companies to see the value in contributing to open source. You've all seen this diagram, I'm sure. So, it's just the idea that you have a problem, an engineer solves it by drinking coffee and producing sarcasm, right? So if you make that a bit more specific to software engineering, you just replace the engineer by a software engineer, and the output, the solution is expressed in code. So this is what happens when you're actually working on open source code and not only on proprietary code. What you see is suddenly you have this pool that is the commons pool, software that everyone can use, everyone can rely on, and the output of that engineer goes into that pool. But what's really interesting is that suddenly this engineer is not alone working on that software anymore, or just working with colleagues, right? He or she, is working with a whole other number of engineers coming from different companies, with different perspectives, some of them working for companies, some of them hobbyists, some of them working for, nonprofits. So a whole different background of people. And what starts to happen is that these people, these engineers working on that software, start having conversations together, right? And there's a whole set of things that happen. Code reviews, there's mentoring that starts to happen. You might have events, you might have, basically the community basically sprouts, is created around this common. Remember when we were talking about the sarcasm byproduct, right? Well, there is a byproduct to this too, right? We always look at open source, we always look at the value of open source as being the code, right? But we tend to forget that there's a whole lot of byproducts. And if you look at them, there are a whole lot of byproducts, right? And what's interesting is you can organize these byproducts into roughly 4 different categories. Some of those are things that are going to benefit the project you're working on directly. For example, documentation is a typical example, right? You probably have onboarding for your software that is much better because if once you've been asked a question 5 times as to how do I download that, how do I build it, someone is going to come up and actually improve the README. But it's not the only benefit. At the engineer's level, at the individual level, you have benefits like just learning from the community. You have, you adopt best practices. You improve your soft skills because when you have to take on leadership, maybe for a subset of the project to just maintain it, you have to talk with people from very different backgrounds, very different cultures, through a medium which is not an easy one, right? And without the ability to go up to management to fix a problem, you have to fix the problem yourself by communicating with people. And that creates actually, all of that creates benefits at the team level, right? Teams, and I'm going to talk about research just in a little while that shows how teams that contribute to open source are actually much better and more efficient teams than teams that don't. It creates a concept that I really like called knowledge spillover, which is basically the idea that as people move from project to project and create networks across the open source space, they start to bring in connections when they move from one company to another that they can tap into and have a solid network that really fosters innovation and makes them more efficient. And finally, at the organization level, an active open source practice is going to help with the culture, it's going to help with hiring, it's going to help with a whole lot of things. Two quick examples. So the efficiency. There was a research by the Harvard Business School, Professor Frank Nagel, who worked on the Linux kernel for a long time, figuring out and came to the conclusion that teams that were actively contributing to the project actually became twice as efficient in their daily work, so not the open source work, the work that they were actually paid for, than teams that did not. And there were two reasons for that. The first one is that they were just much better at understanding the lower level. So whenever there was leaky abstractions, they could actually figure out what the problem was and not lose a lot of time on debugging, for example. And the other part was they just had a massively good network to tap on whenever they had an issue. And so yeah, it's actually it's fascinating because it's not 20% more, right, or 3% more. It's actually twice as effective. And then the other example, which is the example I give quite a bit, which comes from Facebook. So when Facebook did really rethought the way it was presenting itself as an open source company, so that is way before sort of the scandals that Facebook is in now, which has tarnished its reputation with developers. But before that, when it actually invested heavily in open source, we did surveys internally to see what impact it had. And it turned out that 75% of new recruits were actually saying that Facebook's open source program had played a key aspect in them accepting the job offer. Which, when you think about Facebook, circa 2013, 2014, 2015, is incredible because it was a company that was had just IPO'd or was about to IPO, that was seen as the hottest tech company in Silicon Valley, and still their open source program was highly effective at recruiting talent. And out of that change in perception, that's how Facebook also was able to recruit all of the talent around React. So it really had a massive impact on the company. So yeah, for me, the key to open source sustainability is really to make companies understand what's in it for them, what they can get out of open source. And not to focus only on funding a few projects, but really changing the mentality around the way open source companies work. The companies see open source and basically turn them into more friendly companies to open source because they understand how they can benefit. And that's it. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions, obviously.
Questions?
Or comments also.
Yeah. Do you think that's the business model of companies like Sneak.io, if you've heard of them? They basically do open source monitoring, and they're hired by companies with a big open source stack, and they do bug fixing and they kind of have a delayed response time to make the bugs known to the rest of the open community.
It's a security-focused company, right?
Yeah.
Like their logo is a dog or something like that?
That's the one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's fantastic that there's a whole ecosystem of companies around open source, and there's a ton of room for lots of business models at like a reasonable scale. Like I don't expect that company, I mean, look at, Black Duck, I don't know if you're familiar with Black Duck. Well, it's sort of like a medium-sized company. They probably employ like 200 to 400 people now, and they do open source compliance and governance issues. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of room for that, like absolutely 100%. But if we want to solve the problem of open source sustainability as a whole, all of these small efforts help, but without a cultural shift and without an alignment between business objectives of companies at large and contributing to open source, we're not going to solve the problem. That's sort of the key point I'm trying to make. Yeah. But yes, I think those are great. I mean, the more thriving this ecosystem is, the better.
So yeah, it seems like, as you said, like Facebook and these big companies are basically now the main drivers of these huge open source projects. Do you think there's any big disadvantages in that, or does that mean basically, well, the problem is not really that much of a problem anymore because even the big companies now understand that this is the way to go, right?
Well, the thing is, when you say the big companies, you're essentially talking about the large tech companies in Silicon Valley. And that's a very small percentage of where the developers are in the world. Like today, every company is a tech company, and those who are not tech companies are not going to be around in a decade, right? I mean, when you talk about digital transformation, that's basically what we're talking about. Is how if like tech is not your spine, you really don't stand a chance against a company that is leveraging tech. So whereas these large tech companies clearly understand the value of open source and have been using it not only to hire people, but also if you look at the cloud wars that's going on right now between Azure and AWS, it's all about getting developer mindshare through open source contributions, right? So they have there are strategic advantages for these businesses that they're really leveraging. But the problem is all of the rest of the world isn't doing that, right? If you look at, large banks, for example, well, in Geneva, but in the States it's the same thing. They're absolutely full of developers. I have it's like in the tens of thousands in large American banks, right? And they're not allowed to contribute to open source at all, right? So all of these companies are the ones whose mindshare we have to shift, and not everyone is lucky enough or willing to work for tech giants. So I would say for these companies, sure, but then there's the rest of the world that we have to convince.
Yeah, in the same direction, I think that here we are mostly like developers on our day-to-day
sure.
job, and we are pretty well convinced already of the value of open source.
Yes.
But we feel the shift in the mentality as soon as we reach management,
yes.
of people having like the cordon de la bourse,
yeah.
because for them this value does not exist. So how can we ourselves make this barrier? Like maybe by giving the numbers you're giving, but still we don't have many arguments saying like, okay, I can take my Friday afternoon working on this open source project. It will be beneficial. No one will hear that. I mean,
I know it's a problem, but it is a fact that it will help, right? I think we, at our level, we agree with this. Like, developers know that open source actually really benefits the company that we're working for. But we're very bad at articulating why. And one of the things that we're really missing is data. We don't have good data. So, the 2 data points I've given, I've looked over the whole web and over all of my contacts to find those. So I'm actually starting to work with a couple of universities in the States to get more data around this. So it's certainly something that we can do. But for me, the key is finding alignment between your company's business objectives and open source. So you know, if you look at, for example, if you look at the slides, this slide, right? You look at this, you know, you say, well, you know, what actually matters to us? Are we, you know, does being perceived as an industry leader, is that something that can help marketing make, you know, sell its a product, for example? Do we, are we having a problem, are we like in a place where the cost of living is super expensive? We'd like to do more remote work, for example. Well, being remote friendly is something that is gonna, you know, open source is gonna help with this, this is gonna help open source. So basically finding, specifically to your company, alignment with, between what open source can provide in terms of those sort of byproducts and what your company, how can those move the needles that executives in your company care about? So it's specific to every company. One of the key things is hiring. Like pretty much every company is having a hard time hiring talent, and there is nothing that helps with hiring like open source does. Because when you think about it, it's funny because I was on the phone with a company that does sourcing and recruiting as a job, and I was asking them, what do you look at when you look at candidates? And what does everyone look at? GitHub, right? Does that person have any open source projects? That is the first step to assess a candidate, right? And when you think about it, it's completely strange that the same companies that are going to look at that at first usually have a terrible open source profile themselves. Because what do you do as a developer is you look, oh, is this company any good at open source? Oh, not really. Do I want to go work there? Maybe not. Why? Because you know that the next time you'll be looking for a job, people are going to look at your GitHub account and say, well, this person hasn't been working on anything for the last 3 years. Does that person, do they know how to use React or whatever the new trend is? Probably not, right? So basically, working in a company that doesn't do any open source as a developer really hurts your chances of nailing a really good job afterwards. So, you know, the opposite of that obviously is a company that lets you work on an exciting open source project as part of your job is super attractive because you know that you're going to get out of there with a really good-looking GitHub account, right? And the other aspect is the way a company does open source is usually very much a mirror of the culture of that company. And as developers, even if we don't do that consciously, when we look at that, we see this company doesn't look like a nice company to work on because of how they're doing open source. And the end result is we actually pick companies without even being aware of on sort of how they do open source. So yes, making companies aware of that, showing them how it helps with not only hiring but also retaining talent, to me is one of the easiest way and one of the things that is the most common to all companies that employ developers.
Even Microsoft is cool now. Regarding it, you think it's one of the goals they try to achieve by
100%. So Microsoft's strategy is super clear. They're competing in the cloud to sell cloud, right? And their competition is AWS, who is notably terrible at open source, at being a good open source citizen. And what's funny is AWS is investing heavily in open source now for the last 2-3 years. Like it's not really, we're not super aware of it yet because they're not very good at promoting it, but they just gave like a ton of money to the Apache Foundation. They've been working on tons of things. They're building a whole organization internally to move open source forward. So Microsoft's strategy is very simple. They bought GitHub. Developers go on GitHub. They work on open source there. Like you're gonna see on GitHub pretty soon a really easy way to do continuous integration, deployment, free for open source projects, right? Just like a click of a button. People are gonna start using, developers are gonna start using Azure for that because it's gonna be easier. And then once you've built a prototype for your company and once you know how to use the tool because you've used them on your open source projects, when comes the time to do the new product for your company or deploy the new thing, well, you're going to use those tools, right? So it's an on-ramping strategy to get the developer to buy developer mindshare. That's why they bought GitHub. Why else would they buy GitHub, right? And IBM just bought Red Hat for the exact same reason. So no, there are definitely like huge strategic goals behind these acquisitions and behind its strategy, and just the way Microsoft has completely changed the way it's perceived. I mean, every developer thinks Microsoft is like the cool brand now, right? And that was not the case 5 years ago. So what's interesting is with an organization that big, with such a bad reputation, right? You can actually change how it's global perception of your brand in like 5 years. So imagine if your perception is not as bad and you're smaller. I mean, it can be a really effective way to set a foothold and a strong foothold and become an industry leader in a certain vertical. Like I really, I'm a big believer that it's a really a good strategy if the alignment is good with what it is you're offering. Typically APIs, software. If you're in the business of having APIs or selling any kind of software, like you should have a really strong open source strategy. Should we do a last one and go eat food?
No.
Or no last
What
one?
else?
Yes, please.
And did you encounter issues with IP, intellectual property, and
Yes.
these questions of licensing?
Yes. Especially in companies that are tied to hardware, where they have an understanding of IP, of patents, that basically translates directly to dollar amounts, right? So hardware companies know roughly a patent in that space is going to bring $1 million in like 5 years or something like that. Right? They have like through RAND, right? Through licensing. And so they have a hard time with that. But at the same time, it's funny because I have a talk that really talks about these different issues, right? Which is called Making the Business Case for Open Source. And when I talk about this, it's a question of weighing, as always, it's a question of trade-off, right? And we were talking about Microsoft just a few minutes ago. Microsoft just gave away all of its patents that they were using, patents that Android requires, right? They just did that like, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, right? So they run that, and they were making roughly $2 billion a year, $2 billion, like 2 of those huge towers off of these patents, right? And they've just decided to stop, see how we make mistakes with those big numbers? Not 2 towers, like a number of pallets, not 2 trillion, 2 billion, apologies. But still, it's a sizable amount of money on licensing fees, right? And they just gave those away essentially to really show their commitment to open source. So it's basically a marketing strategy, right, against an IP strategy. To me, in the life cycle of companies, they tend to care about IP and making money off of patents when that's the only thing that's left. When all of the developers have left for the new cool startups, and the only thing that are left is like middle management and lawyers and IP, right? And they start monetizing those. So it's usually not, when your company's in the business of monetizing like IP, it's not a good sign, right? So yes, and of course people are scared of giving away IP, but you have to balance it against innovation and mind share and a strong position in the market.
I was asking because I ran into an issue. Last year we were hired by a company which wanted to create such a culture internally, and when it came to the time where so they hired us, brought us in, also invited pals and developers around us to join in their company because they really wanted to create a space. And when we came to the time to sign the contract, of course, so they sent me kind of a 30 pages contract, and which had very strong terms about copyright, which they bought, they wanted to buy it. So I raised the issue asking, guys, we can't contribute to open source projects like this, we need another policy. So they asked me for a proposal, which I did. So I rewrote the whole contract, restructured it, rewrote it. And the CTO was very much willing to help, but we went to the juridical, let's say, level.
Yes.
And they had no understanding of this.
Yes.
We
So
abandoned the case because it became way too much complex. For
I
me.
run into these issues all the time. I've spent a lot of my time at Facebook talking with lawyers. I spent a lot of my time at W3C talking with lawyers. And generally, I spend a lot of my time talking with lawyers. The question is that, so I mean, I could literally take, so it's funny because I have another talk, which is on that topic. I could literally take the slides out. But basically the problem is you have two worlds that are very different. Developers and legal that think very differently about the same kind of problems and that have a hard time talking to one another. Right? So that's part of what I do as a job is I help them talk together because I have a developer background, but I've spent too much time with lawyers, so I sort of know how they work. And it's a question of like having the right conversations, and then at the end of the day, it's a business question, right? If the business of your company is innovation and shipping a product, then like securing a whole bunch of like IP that is not core to your business is a waste of everyone's time, and you should not be doing that. On the other hand, if you're building a patent portfolio because you're going to get attacked by other people in the industry, like what you see, for example, in the mobile space, right? Then you absolutely need to take that into consideration. And as a developer, you can't go there and say, well, we want to do on this, play this open source game, when legal comes and said, well, we just spent $500 million buying patents. We're certainly not going to all open source them now, right? So it's a question of, it's a business decision. So what you have, in such a case, what you have to do is understand the motivation behind the legal team, understand the business, and then sit the CEO, the IP counsel, and the CTO at the same table, and ask them, okay, so what are the business objectives of the company? Does open source help these businesses? Does it hurt them? Does IP help those businesses? Does it hurt them? And you just figure out what the best strategy is. And sometimes it's not going to be in favor of open source. That's okay. Sometimes it is. You just have to be honest in both cases, right? If it's not going to work, if it doesn't make sense for that company, then well, tough luck. Go find a job somewhere else. Yeah, it's like that's how it is, right? All right, I think we should do food now.
Yes, exactly. So